This game needs something. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and let's talk about the current state of Final Fantasy XIV, and what I think it really lacks, and that is excitement. I am a big fan of MMORPGs. I grew up with them. I played RuneScape when I was a kid. I then moved to World of Warcraft with the beginning of Cataclysm, and early on in Stormblood, I joined Final Fantasy XIV and fell in love with the game. And I still love Final Fantasy XIV. And look, I get that there's a lot of negativity going around Final Fantasy XIV right now, and I've talked about that before, in regards to Dawntrail, in regards to 7.1, a little bit less so with 7.1, but I still remain relatively optimistic for the future of Dawntrail. And I think 7.1 kind of highlights the biggest issue that I have with Final Fantasy XIV, despite liking 7.1, and that is 14's aversion to excitement. That sounds really critical, but what do I mean by this? It is no secret that Final Fantasy XIV is a formulaic game, with a formulaic content cadence. Generally speaking, we know what we're getting with each patch. There's not much in the way of a surprise. Like, even when we look forward to the new content coming in Dawntrail in, say, 7.2, 7.3.4.5, whatever, even for pieces of content that haven't explicitly been shown yet, we can kind of hazard a guess as to what they'll probably end up looking like. The new Bosja zone, I can almost guarantee you, is going to be composed of a series of fates leading to cool epic encounters. That's probably what it's going to be. Now, I know there's some people out there that didn't like Bosja. I'm not one of those people. I quite enjoyed Bosja. Was it perfect? No, but with a bit of iteration, I think it could be very fun and interesting in a new form. Hopefully that's what we get. But I think when it comes to a game that is, let's be fair here, a live service like an MMORPG like Final Fantasy XIV, being able to look into the future and be excited about something and not knowing entirely what awaits us in the future is something that I do think is intrinsically important to the health and the well-being of an MMORPG. I think a good example of this that didn't particularly pan out all that well for Final Fantasy XIV are Island Sanctuaries. Those were wildly hyped when they were announced back for Endwalker, mainly because the game hadn't seen anything like that up to this point, and the idea that we as an individual player could have our own private island was really cool. Kind of panned out to be a bit repetitious, and not what a lot of us were hoping for, despite wildly exaggerated expectations, but I think that gameplay feature is a good microcosm of what Final Fantasy XIV kind of needs. It needs to have something that the community can look to and be like, oh, that looks really cool, we haven't seen anything really like that yet. This feels fresh and new. It doesn't have to be a new big raid fight or anything like that. It could be. Doing the new 24-man, totally not savage mode, that's a cool idea. Will it pan out for the longevity of the game? Maybe not. But in, like, the small scale of it, it's a good idea to flesh out the content offering for the game. Same thing when they brought in Unreal Trials. That's a really great way to take old content and make it current and bring a bit of excitement into the game. It's on the smaller scale of things, but I think being able to have a healthy balance between these smaller bouts of excitement and these larger bouts of excitement is important. You don't just want one or the other, you want a healthy mix of both. And I think when it comes to modern Final Fantasy XIV, and especially with Dawntrail up to this point, what it's really been lacking has been that overwhelming big excitement piece. And this has really dawned on me ever since I went back to play World of Warcraft again. Because again, I love MMORPGs. I'm not gonna be the type of guy to say one is inherently better than the other, rah go local sports team when it comes to a freaking video game. And now that World of Warcraft is back on track and going in a direction that I really enjoy and like, I really like the idea of being able to play both games and compare these two games that I really do love. Like, I love doing that kind of stuff. I love talking about video games if this channel wasn't an indicator of that. And I think excitement is arguably one of the most important elements for a live service game like an MMORPG. And I think I know what they're trying to do in this regard when it comes to the patch cadence for Final Fantasy XIV. Generally speaking, the story of a .0 patch, the expansion launch, is significantly more than just a standard patch. so they can relegate a lot of the actual content offering for an expansion to late in the patch cycle in hopes that the excitement generated and garnered by the main story in, say, 0.0 and 0.1 is enough to tide over the community until the content really comes online, which gives them more time to develop it and flesh it out. That's a sound idea in theory, but I think in terms of execution with Dawntrail, it's left a little bit to be desired, mainly because the story for Dawntrail has been rather polarizing. It hasn't been my cup of tea particularly. There's been elements that I like, and I'm way more optimistic for the storytelling of Dawntrail after 7.1, though I know not everyone has been. At the end of the day, our perception of stories and storytelling is inherently subjective. I think the plot is far more interesting, has been covering more interesting topics. I could not care less about the whole Veronique section in 7.1, but all the stuff with Fiend, I think, has been really interesting to me. It could easily be a rehash of what they did with Elidibus back in Shadowbringers. I'm hoping it's not. There's still plenty of ways for the story to go in a different direction. I'm willing to hear them out in that regard. I don't want to be overly pessimistic about it, and in fact, I'm kind of optimistic in regards to that. I really enjoy Final Fantasy IX, and I think Alexandria has been overall pretty good for me, but I think the big thing that Dawntrail has been lacking up to this point in time has been a real big exciting moment. There's no moment that's got me to think about the game and just forced me to sit back and think for like an hour or so, like I got with Shadowbringers. That final standoff against Emmett Selk, Grahatia coming out of nowhere to bring in our raid group, or like that final 1v1 against Xenos and Endwalker. Dude, as a big Xenos fan, loved every moment of that. And I loved Endwalker so much. And it's stories like that that can really grip you and keep you interested and engaged with the product, even when the content offering is a bit basic, and kind of what we expect out of Final Fantasy XIV. You'll get some trials, you get some raids, get some dailies, whatnot. Bob's your uncle. And I think for the longest time, Final Fantasy XIV in this early expansion era relies on the excitement that it is able to generate from expert storytelling. And the vibe of Dawntrail just wasn't particularly conducive to that, but I think it's going in a direction where it could in the future, but that doesn't particularly help us right now. It's one of the reasons I'm, as I've said before, optimistic for the future of Dawntrail, because I think the story is going in a direction where we can get a lot of those cool moments in the near future, but also a lot of those pieces of content that were advertised for Dawntrail should be coming online within the next few patches. And if you combine that with ideally better storytelling and more cool moments happening in the story in the near future, then we should be good. But we'll come into this problem again when it comes to 8.0 and 8.1, unless something is inherently addressed with the content cadence of Final Fantasy XIV. Because I don't know. I think it is sustainable. I just don't know if it should be. What do I mean by this? I'm not gonna do manga anything like that and say Final Fantasy XIV's gonna die if we go through another period like this, or anything like that. I think that's silly, I think that's nonsense. But I think the game can be better and should aim to be better. And the game just simply needs excitement. People can only play the same styles of content over and over and over again for years on end until eventually it becomes a bit stale, repetitive, or just uninteresting to them. This happens a lot of times when you have people who have played a game for 5-10 years or so, and if the game doesn't substantially change and evolve over time, eventually, no matter how good it is inherently, there will be a lot of people out there that just have seen it before, and it doesn't spark the same level of excitement and joy that it once did. And I think when you look on Over Across the River and you look at World of Warcraft, they're trending in this direction as well, where that game has been out since 2004. You can't just keep throwing out this same exact game and expect people to stick around for all those years. You have to be able to draw in new players, but also retain those older ones if you ideally want to grow. So what has WoW done? They added a new piece of content with the War Within, their latest expansion called Delves, which are smaller scale dungeons, and you have an NPC companion that you can change the build of, and you can run them solo or with a few extra people of your choosing if you so want to. Nothing too terribly complex, but I've been really enjoying them. Looking forward to the next expansion. What's coming out then? Player housing for World of Warcraft, something Final Fantasy XIV has had for the longest time, but WoW never really had. We're not going to count garrisons here, they sucked. But in the context and confines of World of Warcraft, something like player housing will generate a ton of excitement and will make a lot of people want to look back to World of Warcraft. Or, for existing players, they'll look forward to the future because it's something new and exciting for that game. I think Final Fantasy XIV doesn't necessarily need something to the scale because we already have player housing, but it needs something. And it needs something new, that's fresh, that is additive, but doesn't feel forced. Relic weapons are a good way to bring about a bunch of excitement because people just love weapons. It's a tale as old as time when it comes to RPGs. You really don't need to reinvent that formula because people just like weapons. And people generally like going after new relic weapons. What was the issue in Endwalker? You forced people to do Hildebrand. I love Hildebrand. I'm looking forward to the new Hildebrand stuff. A lot of people out there, they just don't mesh with that, don't vibe with it. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. But when you force those people to partake in that content, it's going to leave a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I don't think that's something that Final Fantasy XIV necessarily needs to lean into. Now, with all the pieces of content that are likely coming in Dawntrail, new Deep Dungeon, new Variant Dungeon, new Bosja, that takes place in totally not the Bermuda Triangle, there's a lot of things you could tie into the new relic weapon. And if they look really awesome, and the grind isn't a pain in the penis, that could go a long way. Now, I personally think that if you readjust the reward structure for Variant Dungeons a bit, that could really bring that new piece of content that was introduced with Endwalker online and make it way more popular if the incentivization to run it is far more rewarding and enjoyable. Say it has some really cool mounts or minions, or has a bunch of cool glamour, or could be a really cool way to gear alt jobs. There's a bunch of different ways that you can tap into this game to incentivize doing content. Now, I think Square Enix agrees with a lot of the things I've talked about in this video because of those smaller scale points of excitement we talked about before. It may not be the exact thing a lot of people necessarily want, but I do think it's a data point in that direction, and that's Cloud of Darkness Chaotic, namely Chaotic in general. I've wanted more modes in Final Fantasy XIV that lean into that MMO element of MMORPG, leaning a bit more into larger number of player-based content, like Chaotic does go in that direction. And I think when you look back to Endwalker and you look back to, say, Island Sanctuaries, that is the type of content that we're talking about here. And like one of the possible iterations that it can take. Same with Variant Dungeons. But you can't just have a good idea, you have to execute on that good idea in an engaging and fun way. It is an MMORPG. One-off pieces of content generally don't have longevity by nature. And for an MMORPG, longevity and replayability are important factors. They aren't the only thing, but for endgame, they tend to be massively important. And I think something that Final Fantasy XIV could really benefit from is having something in regards to open world content. Because yes, fate farming exists, yes, hunts exist, but they're not particularly the most engaging pieces of content out there, at least for me. Maybe they are for you, and that's entirely fine. But what I'm trying to say is, I think the structures already exist in the history of Final Fantasy XIV and in the content that is coming in the rest of Dawntrail to bring that excitement back into Final Fantasy XIV, but I think 14 needs something new that's evergreen, that will be there for when we come across the same period of time when we get to 8.0 and 8.1 in the future to freshen the experience up. So with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content. I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe. Have a great day. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Till we meet again.